History is fun, or it's meant to be. As a history teacher and a history buff, I do enjoy binge watching historical documentaries, and these can vary from really exaggerated mass audience affairs to serious productions with interviews with experts and high production values. And again, these can be proper official productions from studios and channels to amateur work done by YouTubers such as myself. What these productions have to balance is entertainment and education. Now, sometimes the balance isn't quite right, and as a result, some documentaries may exaggerate facts or present certain myths and misconceptions that perpetuate. And regardless of whether this is from, again, an amateur YouTuber or a professional production company, these things can creep in and cause confusion when it comes to our understanding of history and of archery. So, here are 10 things to look out for when watching historical documentaries focusing on archery. The first pattern is using the wrong experts. Obviously, we can't go back in time and pluck a person from that period to come and talk to us and show us how to do archery. The next best thing is getting someone who has practiced or trained with a historical society or traditional school. Sometimes you get people who have less impressive credentials. Maybe at best they're descended from someone who wants to use the bow. And then you get to the level where the historian or the host themselves does a demonstration. And sometimes the host or the historian does have credible skill in that area, but sometimes they don't. And when you have someone who doesn't actually know how to use the bow, then you can get a lot of mistakes and gaffes. Number 2 is using wrong techniques. Now, there's no one correct way to do archery. There are many wrong ways, but there are many ways, even within a single style, to correctly do archery. So it's kind of unfair to nitpick and identify discrepancies when these things would have been done, except when they weren't. Thanks to records and traditions which have been preserved, we actually have a fairly good understanding of how historic archers might have shot. We generally do know how the English archers would have used their bows. We know how the Mongols would have used their bows. We know how the Japanese samurai would have used their bows. We can, with some certainty, say which side the bow was used by an English archer versus a Japanese archer. So when we see a supposedly Japanese samurai descendant using a 2-finger Mediterranean grip on the left side of a Japanese Yumi, that's weird. And that's a pretty good sign of zero research and credibility. Number 3 is using the wrong equipment. Now, unfortunately, with archery, we don't have functional specimens of historical bows. Bows were organic items, so they would decompose over time, and people never really saw a reason to keep them. While we do have some examples of really finely made bows, most functional bows were simply sticks and strings, and people would discard them, use them for firewood, or otherwise lose them. We have a few samples from the Mary Rose of English longbows. There might be a few bows frozen in ice somewhere, but by and large, we don't have actual samples of bows that we can actually demonstrate with. Therefore, production companies have to resort to modern replicas of the bow, and often they are built for the show as close to the original specifications as possible. Sometimes, however, and this is more so for the amateur productions, we have to use modern analogs when talking about historical bows. This in itself can be quite misleading because the things that we have today actually weren't around back then, and many modern traditional bows, if that makes any sense, contain features which were actually modern inventions. For example, many modern traditional bows have a window cut out of the riser, so the arrow is close to the center shot, which largely negates much of the archer's paradox, which influenced a lot of ancient styles. And then there's confusion over different bow types. For example, people might talk about English longbows, but they're actually holding Victorian era longbows from the 1800s or modern replicas of such, whereas the actual English longbows, the war bows, which were used in the 100 Years' War, were much thicker and much heavier. So again, while technically they're both English longbows, we can come to the wrong conclusions because we're holding the wrong gear. This is essentially the wrong prop for your video. Number 4 is not specifying draw weight. Now, as a younger person, I really love matchups, like which civilization was better, which archer was stronger. And TV shows really love to play this one-on-one matchup. The problem is that often these matchups are rigged to make it much closer than they actually were. And one oversight, or something which is overlooked in production, is draw weight. Draw weight is a measurement of how strong the bow is, or how much force it takes to pull the string back. This is essential because this is effectively what dictates the power of the bow. And what ends up happening is that you get people shooting perhaps a historically accurate replica, but of a much lower draw weight than was actually used. You might get a Yumi versus a 40 or 50 pound English longbow, but the actual war bows used during the 100 Years' War were well over 100 pounds. So you kind of can't really compare these things fairly when you're not using the actual weights used historically. Again, understandably, the host or the demonstrator might not have the physical capability to use a proper bow of a proper draw weight. But again, you are kind of putting a false analog by saying that this bow is only so fast and penetrates so far when you're not using the proper equipment. And again, unfortunately, a lot of production companies and TV shows won't even bother including draw weight. It's something which, as an archer, you have to know. It's kind of like doing ballistic gel testing with a bullet, but not specifying what gun it came from. Number 5 is unrealistic distances. Most testing done in TV shows is typically done in very short distance, maybe less than 10 meters in some cases. Now this makes some sense. It's much easier to set up a filming studio and a small test range, and you want to show the expert or the archer demonstrate their technique and not show them missing, which will look pretty bad. However, again, when you have an unrealistic scenario, bows don't perform the way they would in actual combat situations because this is just unrealistically close. The issue with the lack of range is that it tends to portray archers as being 100% accurate, and it might embellish their personal precision. Realistically, an archer could get a fairly good hit rate at around 50 meters. That's when many archers in war would have engaged in direct shooting. So not long range volleys, but direct shooting at close distance targets. Does it mean that we hit every single time? That's a little different. But they could be deadly accurate up to 50 meters. But at very short distances, that gets a little extreme. In reality, most beginners, like first-time shooters, people who come to an archery club and pick up a bow for the first time, can acquire a fairly good level of consistency within an hour. So again, this doesn't really prove much. On a similar note, number 6 is exaggerated accuracy. And again, this often plays in the hands of the host or the demonstrator. The producer wants them to show their excellent accuracy. So they might do things like shoot through very small targets, or do skill shots or trick shots, or call where they're going to shoot. And if this was in an authentically challenging environment, like shooting an aspirin pill or shooting a ring, that's a very high demonstration of skill. But when you have static targets at 10 meters, it's actually not that difficult. Look, even I can do this. Right target, groin. Left target, groin. Left target, right testicle. And we combine other things like throwing discs and hitting them at 5 meters away. Again, it's actually not that hard. These are very basic drills that some people do in their training. And for those who don't do it, they can easily do so. It's, again, not difficult. Number 7 is a pet peeve and a pet hate for many historical channels, and that is chainmail testing. This is such a favorite for documentaries. To show that arrows can pierce armor, they put chainmail on a dummy and they shoot it, and the arrow goes right through it, as if the chainmail was made from paper links or something. Unfortunately, that is very close to the truth. Now, the problem with chainmail testing is that there are many different kinds of mail in history, and the cheapest kind that producers usually use is buttered mail. That's when the individual links are actually not enclosed, they're not sealed. So the result is that they can pop open with very little effort. You can literally rip it apart with your bare hands. So of course it's not going to stop a sword or a spear or an arrow. Real chainmail would have been riveted. That is to have a seal, so each link is fully enclosed and is quite strong. And there are different densities of chainmail, different styles, so they would have a much greater chance of deflecting arrows and not failing. In addition, armor was typically worn in layers. So you have a layer of padded armor like gambeson, and then you have mail, and then later on you have plate mail. So testing individual parts of armor isn't a real test. And again, unfortunately, many production companies take shortcuts by only using the chainmail because it looks shiny on screen. That's, again, an exaggerated performance of the bow and arrow. Number 8 is another favorite of documentaries, and that's ballistic gel testing. We often see this with firearms more so than bows and arrows, but bows shoot projectiles, so we use gel to show how deadly the arrows were. And firstly, again, it's often done at extremely short distances, like 5 meters or so. The second thing is that arrows actually don't react very well with ballistic gel. Now, bullets work well because they're very small and you can track the shock wave and the path of the bullet through ballistic gel. Arrows are long objects and they have a very wide diameter. What happens is that when the arrow enters the gel, it actually begins to collapse on itself, and the friction of the gel basically slows the arrow down much more than what would have happened if it was shooting at an actual flesh target. The consequence is you see the experts and the presenters pull out the arrow and they go, whoa, but it only penetrated this much. That's actually not what the arrow can do. It can do a lot more than that, especially when you're using heavy draw weight at extremely short distances. And again, with the thicker diameter of traditional arrows, you won't see that penetration. So again, it's very misleading. And when you start packing again armor or leather on top of that to simulate someone wearing armor, it's just not realistically what would have happened. And in fact, you can actually rig this test to be an overperformer. Again, because the penetration is closely tied to the arrow diameter, modern target arrows, which are very skinny, can go right through several blocks of ballistic gel. So these things don't prove much. Number 9 is perhaps more seen in the cut scenes, which the documentaries tend to use, and that is volley fire. It's a very popular trope in movies and in film, and of course in documentaries. That's when you see the whole formation of archers do the whole draw, aim, shoot sort of thing. And yeah, it looks pretty epic, but that's actually not how archers generally fought. They could do that, and they definitely would have done that, but that was not the best way to deploy archers. Archers were actually more akin to machine guns than artillery, as people are prone to say. While they could lob arrows at targets indirectly, they were most deadly within the 50 meter to 70 meter distance, because the heavy warbows would be raining arrows in direct shooting. That's where we see them mostly used. Unfortunately, it's very rare to see a demonstration or a cutscene where the actors or the archers do this kind of shooting. Again, part of this is because of production limitations, because most people can't shoot a 100-pound warbow with the 30 or 40-pound props at best, if not 20-pound PVC replicas. They're basically lobbing arrows a long distance. Even shooting at a 60-meter target, they're aiming quite high. And that's, again, for safety reasons, so they can't actually shoot the way they did historically. That's understandable, but again, that can cloud our perception of archery, because an actual historical archer would have been far deadlier with a much faster arrow compared to what we see reenacted. The last issue with documentaries is just the fact that they overstate everything. Again, this is a part of the entertainment side of the documentaries, especially focusing on archery. You have things like the samurai or Agincourt, and they really embellish and exaggerate how deadly the archer was. The problem is that that's actually not how battles were fought historically. You can come up with what-if scenarios and show the archers doing their thing, but archers were seldom deployed as an actual independent unit. Most of the time, they were sent in to support other parts of the forces. There were very few battles which were determined by archers. Their role was to skirmish and harass, that is, they meant to shoot at other soldiers, most of whom could not shoot back. But when the fighting did escalate, it was the infantry and the cavalry which decided the battle, not the archers. Again, there are some exceptions, but most battles were won and lost at the point of a spear, not the tip of an arrow. And consequently, when we start creating scenarios where an archer would be a rapid-firing commando, that's probably not how they would have been deployed. It's just not a reliable way to fight. There are much more consistent methods, and again, most people were not archers. So with the rank and file being spearmen and swordsmen, that's where the battle was won and lost. And look, as an archer, as much as I love seeing archers kick ass, I know the limitations in real life and in history. So we have to be mindful of how much we buy into the narrative that is presented to us in documentaries. So that's my list of 10 things that historical documentaries sometimes get wrong about archery. What do you think? And what are some things you might add? This is NUSensei. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.